Welcome to Sumbits, where we decode the PowerSchool development experience. Sumbits is brought to you by MBA. Let's start the show.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Sumbit. My name's Sean Cobby, and as always, joined by Eric Scheidel and Ryan Cockrum with us today. Today's episode is going to be about worst code that we ever wrote. I'm definitely feeling like we're going to be hearing a lot more from Ryan and Eric today. They're definitely more experienced developers than I am. So we'll see how the conversation goes. But I think, well, first of all,
this guy just thinks he's written better code.
For sure. As always, we are having a little cocktail with you guys today. As you can see probably by the shirt and maybe by the bottle over here, I'm enjoying some Bell Mead Reserve today. Little Tennessee whiskey. What are you guys drinking today?
Well, I poured myself a Trash Panda by 49th Parallel into my fancy schmancy NBA Yeti. That keeps it nice and cold.
Very nice. On my end of the mic, we got Sam Adams, which many people are probably familiar with. But I picked up a variety pack, and they have a holiday porter. And the label says it's dark and robust. And I would agree with that. It is both of those things. It's delightful.
Perfect.
Just like me, dark and robust.
Right. Boy.
Beer, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we're going to talk about bad code, I mean, it is kind of the holiday season. I'm not sure when you're listening to us today, but for us, it's around the holidays, and I think it's a great time to serve up a little humble pie. Before we really get into it, I think it's worth talking about like what makes code bad. Obviously, you can look at code, and if it's not working, it's bad code. But I think we're more towards the aspect of, maybe we're talking about, how it's going to look to a future developer that may have to take a look at your code. Maybe it's just not built to be expandable or used in other ways. So I'm definitely curious to see what you guys would consider bad code. So Eric, you want to start or?
Yeah. I'll hop in there. It's very difficult, I think, to define bad code. I used to preach because we computer nerds, we developers have a tendency to get up on our high horse sometimes, right? Like, oh, the way I do it's the right way. Other people just don't get it. And that's always driven me nuts, man. I really wish, in general, developers were more like those sitting around the mics right now, man. I mean, I love the fact that we can all make fun of one another, look at one another's code, provide constructive criticism, and it's not that never turns into a pissing match. But there definitely are.
Ideally not, anyway.
Ideally not.
Yeah.
But I've definitely seen that attitude out there. So I've always tried to say, there's not really a wrong way to do it as long as it gets the job done. Different people have different approaches. And I've definitely seen other developers. I've looked at their code, and I thought, wow, I really learned something from that. And then I've looked at a few other developers' code, and I thought, well, maybe there is a wrong way to do it. So I definitely think there are more elegant ways to do things, and arguing about what's right and wrong gets, I think, it gets difficult because different people have different opinions. But I think there are certain snippets of code that I've written or that I've seen other developers write that you can look at and go, there's a much more concise and understandable way to do that. And I think that defines good code. Good code should be concise where it can be, but also be understandable. And I think there's a balance that needs to be struck there, because code can be written more concisely, which can make it much more difficult to understand.
Sure.
So I think bad code is unnecessarily lengthy or unnecessarily difficult to comprehend.
Gotcha.
Okay, and I agree with all that, and I even add one more. What did you say? You said concise and clear. I would add on consistent. Well, and that's it, because I mean, you got you got different ways to using Angular and jQuery as a perfect marriage there. Switching from your jQuery or Ajax to your HTTP, you can use jQuery or Ajax in your Angular controller, and I have. So we're talking about exactly, when I wasn't, sometimes because
I'm just gonna jump in. I've done that as well. Learned that lesson the hard way.
Well, and so you miss the app apply call basically when you're doing
Digest
it that
cycle,
way.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that in the digest cycle. But there are callbacks available in the jQuery Ajax that sometimes I really wanted, like the complete and success. And when you're dealing with HTTP, the HTTP service, it's just you got the error and the success callback, but you don't have that complete. So then you figure out how to do it at some point. Before I figured that was my method before I figured out promise chaining. But that's an example of your own worst code, almost like is you're trying to make something work because you don't understand newer concepts. So you're trying to make an unholy marriage of stuff with stuff you're learning because it works. But then a year, 2 years down the line, you look at it and you go, "Oh God, how do I fix that? How many places do I have to fix that?"
So I really enjoy what you just said. You were talking about you didn't realize what tools were available to you, and I think that's a huge part of writing bad code. And I'm going to use my air quotes here while I say bad code. But there are two different bads, I guess, that I've experienced, and one is due to ignorance. Like I didn't realize there was a better way to do that. And the stuff to me that's more offensive is the stuff that's just due to a lack of forethought. It's just like this was architected poorly. You've got 100 lines of code that could have been condensed into 20, and I'm not exaggerating. I've seen this happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there are a couple different.
Laziness plays a part in that as well.
I do.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think here's a perfect example. I think code from a reusability perspective, repetitive code, unnecessarily repetitive code is bad code. And I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, repetitive code is unnecessarily repetitive code. So I've got 5 inputs on my page and I want to attach some type of event listener to those inputs. I put an ID on each one of those and do almost the same thing when I catch an event from each of those inputs. So now I have 5 event listeners and one attached to each of those IDs. And they all do relatively the same thing. Maybe they update some text elsewhere on the page. This is actually a perfect example. I saw someone code this once where there's a table. In the left column, there's an input. On the right column, there's some text. And every input in that left column had an ID attached to it with an event listener that updated the text in the subsequent column in the table. And just learning, I guess, how to leverage other ways to structure your DOM to listen for events based on classes or based on attributes on those inputs. It might be a few extra lines of code within when this triggers, detecting which one triggered. But then, you just say, hey, find the closest table cell, find its sibling, and update the content of that. So maybe I had 10 lines of code repeated 5 times, but now I can have 15 lines of code one time. Mm-hmm. And getting back to the whole readability concept too, concise versus readable, right? When you do something like that, and if I stare at that piece of code, it's not is immediately evident to me exactly what it's doing, perhaps.
True.
But you know what? 15 lines of code versus 50, in the grand scheme of things, especially when you get into larger applications, makes a huge difference.
A lot less to decipher. Yep.
And that's one of the things that I've been guilty of, that I look back at my own code, because right, the title of this episode is The Worst Code You Ever Wrote.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, let's call ourselves out and eat that humble pie that Sean wants to serve up to us. You know, I look at a file that I had written for one of the plugins I've created, and it's 2,000 lines of JavaScript. And sometimes that's a necessary evil, right? You know, if you've got a big application, you're going to need a lot of logic behind that application. But, you know, maybe splitting that, I eventually split that out into separate files so that I can say, all right, if I'm focusing on the functionality of this feature of the program, this is where I'm going to go, instead of hunting through 2,000 lines of code to find it. Sure. But yeah, I've been rambling for a long time now. I think it's time to turn it over to Cox.
I did just want to make one comment. I think laziness.
I was going to address that.
Yeah, it's.
Sorry, I kind of diverted on that.
That's all right. I think it may be a little harsh to say laziness, but
I think it can be accurate.
Well, yeah, but in my opinion, that probably feeds back more to the ignorance side of, instead of taking the time to learn something new and a better way of doing it, I'm just going to do it the way that I know how, and you know, that could end up being bad code because of it. But I want to bring that up again later about, you know, what's that medium of, you know, at what point do I spend the time to go learn a better way versus just doing it the way that I know.
So, and Ryan, I promise I will shut up and let you talk. That's the direction I was trying to go. Thank you for bringing me back to the laziness. Because the point I wanted to make, but I got off on a tangent, was, you know, the lazy way to do it, if I've got those, you know, 5 blocks of code that are repeating, is just, you know, I've got it functioning. It's almost the same. I'm going to copy, paste, replace 1 or 2 values. And now I'm done. I didn't have to think about a more creative way to make it more concise. So in a sense, yeah, that's getting lazy.
Sure.
And so, yeah, like, I mean, I don't think you know, there are lazy examples of bad code. Absolutely. And that can be the sole factor behind it. But then there's other times where it's not lazy, it's necessity. And I liken that to even, like, I mean, where we are, you know, there is an allotment of time behind a given project, something that you have to work when you're in a professional setting, right? It's not just your own thing where you're going to spend all the time you want to make it as perfect as you want. There's a budget.
I would say 9 times out of 10, anybody that we're talking to right now has had somebody come to their desk and say, hey, I need this. I need PowerSchool to do this, and I need it to be doing it yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's never gotten enough forethought to say, you know, maybe we'll look at this next year. I need it now.
And so
I don't know where you guys work. I spend most of my day watching cat videos, but okay.
But that's my point. Though all that though, like, so you have to deliver to your best. And I'm a perfectionist. I like to find the best way to do things, but sometimes you're told, you know, get it done quick, get it done fast, and all the time you're swallowing lumps in your throat, knowing that it could come back to bite you. Yeah. Because especially when you're talking about that one function you've copied 10 times instead of finding a nice concise way to do it once. By submitting arguments, because now you're going to have to fix that code 15 times or 10 times or whatever, instead of just fixing that one function. But in the original delivery, in the original effort, it was quicker to do it with a copy of 10 times, even though you know full well that is not the best practice.
Been there.
Yeah, we've all been there. So that's why I kind of be like, you know what? So definitely laziness is a factor, but also sometimes it's necessity.
Sure. And
that's the whole, the grand scheme of, at the end of the day, if it works, it's good code. You know, there's that. It's not always actually true, but really, if it works and delivers, and the user on the interface side they can't tell the difference on what's happening in the logic. They just know that their button's lighting up the way they wanted it to, and that their input is over there where they wanted it. So it's such a tough thing to gauge, but
Yeah, and something that I think you're both alluding to and never quite just came out and said it is, a lot of times, especially Eric, when you're talking about something that's 2,000 lines of code, you start getting into performance issues and efficiencies, right? So.
Oh, I've had lots of performance issues.
I'm really
Yeah,
gonna leave
check out
that
your
one.
shirt. Yeah. Eric, you want to show everybody your shirt that you got for?
Yes, if anyone can see there, little sloth from the Goonies. Shout out the good old days.
For sure. So I guess when we're talking about bad code and what defines bad code, especially when we're getting into those big projects, I think those efficiencies and those performance issues is definitely something that you can lean on to call something bad just because it was done, and it may perform exactly what you need it to do, but if it's going to take 20 seconds to load the page, was that really good code? Probably not.
So that's interesting. What both of you just said really lends well into something that I wrote down to discuss. Some of the bad code that I've written from a performance perspective. The quick and dirty way to do it, because I was trying to get quantity over quality for the report creator plugin, which I created. We added several years ago the ability to process data access tags in that. And so I created a function to find these data access tags. The difficult thing about this is, and the reason I wanted to shy away from doing it, is because the plugin was supposed to be built to try to avoid using things like data access tags. Sure. More, buttons and drop downs, and not needing to learn pseudo programming to create a report. But finally, we caved and said, if we put this in there, then there's not a whole lot that people can't do if there's something the core functionality can't do. So we allowed them to insert these things there. The problem then is all the other data we could collect and mask for these reports via a query. So you give me this for, give me the stored grades for all students in my current selection. One query, drop back all the data, good to go. But those data access tags are student specific. So every single one of those data access tags required a network call. Go get this data access tag for this kid, the next one for this kid, the next one for this kid. Now, if there's 10, and I've seen hundreds on a report, and you run a report for 100 kids, well, 100 times 100, that's 10,000 right there. Yeah. And they're sitting there staring at their screen going, why hasn't this thing loaded yet? Well, it's just waiting for network traffic. It was short-sighted on my part, not thinking about scalability, not thinking about that worst case scenario, that use case where someone had that many tags, that many students, and how that would impact performance. So the quick and dirty way to get it was
not that much.
Say again?
So, and even at that, like 100 students is not that many. Right.
So I wound up spending several hours retooling that to accommodate, throwing a combination of tags at the server in one network call. It's a lot more complex code, which is unfortunate. It makes the code more difficult to maintain. But at the end of the day, that's something that I always think about when I'm trying to think, what's good code in this scenario? Good code isn't always necessarily, my code at the end of the day is more convoluted, more difficult to read, not nearly as concise, but it's going to make the end user experience much better than it was before. So weighing that balance is a challenge sometimes.
Well, and you know what? It's even funny because I've been in the exact same position where it's 100, 1,000 more network calls to process, generate something, and like what you're saying there, where the user is going to be sitting there. Before I've been here doing development, I've been that user, of course, and like everything, it's about communication. like everything in life. So, maybe sometimes it's not about, and this is the bad code thing. Maybe it's not so much about how long the user has to wait there. It's how long the user has to wait there without understanding
Why they're
what's
waiting.
taking. So there
Amen,
it comes
brother.
down to just spending the time to code a little widget, a little animation with a counter, even if it's nothing, even if it really relates to nothing, but it's just so something the user can see that's happening. It's crazy, and I understand it. How big a difference it makes, because when you see a white screen, when you see a blank screen, you think either A, things are frozen and broken, or B, you don't even know what's going on, I guess, is that's really it, right? You're like, what's going on here? But you see the little spinner. Hey, if it's spinning, that means it's happening. And then, all of a sudden your patience wakes up. And then if you see a nice loading bar, you have something to gauge. Hey, it's at 70%. We're almost there. So I mean, right there's your, there's good code and bad code almost there. And it's like almost in its simplistic form. Give the user something to see. No matter how complex you make it, give them something to understand, regardless of all other aspects. And it just helps. It helps you, whether or not you can consider your code that generates these reports good or bad. It helps them understand that, hey, something's coming.
I mean, that's obviously there's a point where you want to strike the balance, like Eric said. But what is the priority in a developer's mind? Is it the end user experience, or is it more efficient, more concise code for someone else to look at? I would lean towards the user experience, just because, if you're looking at a school district that has one person, creating this customization for them, that's one person that's going to see the code. Maybe somebody else 5 years down the road after they left and took another job and they hired someone else. But you're also talking about 40, 50 staff members that are going to be seeing that end user experience every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's I'm not going to say that defines or really states what good and bad code is. I definitely think we're talking more about the code side of things, but it's definitely something to consider is that end user experience.
Yeah, and I love that Ryan brought up, because it doesn't have so much to do with the code. I mean, obviously you have to code it, but I think we as developers, sometimes we get really stuck in the algorithms and in the bits and bytes, and we forget that a huge part of writing good code is writing a good user interface to present that code. Because my code in the background is really doing the exact same thing, but you hit the nail on the head when you said that's the other problem, is that during that time, we've just got a loading bar, the barber pole. It's like, hey, we're loading stuff. And like you said, Ryan, they're staring at it going, well, but are you?
Right.
And if I can say I've got 90 out of 150 processes complete, then the end user can feel a little more comfortable with that.
Yeah, and then if it's sitting at 90 out of 150 for 2 minutes, something's probably broken.
Now I can call support. Right. Speaking of bad code, I mean, there's something I've done in the past too, where not properly checking for errors. So
I'm so guilty of that too.
And that loading bar is sitting there staring someone in the face, and they're like, yeah, I've been looking at that for half an hour. And then when I dig in to look at it, I'm like, well, yeah, that failed after 5 seconds. We just didn't let you know. And you were waiting for it to finish. That's when you really just want to bury your head in the sand, right?
It's like,
because how many other times did they call you after the 5 seconds and say it hasn't loaded, and then you're like, well, it's still working. You just got to give it some time.
I'm so guilty with the errors, with catching errors, and making them user friendly, readable, and everything like that. And it's kind of like it rolls into two things. One, it's a lot of extra effort, so it's a time thing. But two, it's like you got, like, what's the balance? I guess it's the balance of what is the user you're gonna find helpful, because there's certain things you can be super descriptive about for every possible failure,
Right.
or you can just throw a general PC load letter if you get that one.
I don't
Get
have
your
that
baseball
certain-
bats.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm by the way, I'm pouring in. I don't know if it's supposed to be a reference because the picture on the can, by the way, is a key, but the name of the beverage is 66. So I like to think of it as a Star Wars beer, but I really don't think that's where they were going because it's a New England IPA.
So
I just like to
I'm not
say,
gonna lie. I'm not as big of a Star Wars fan as you are, so I don't understand the 66 reference.
execute Order 66.
Okay. Is that when they killed all the baby Jedis?
And all the Jedis in general.
Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry, tangent there, but yes, that was my second beverage for the afternoon here.
Let me know how that one is. That's if I drink beer, that tends to be the styles that I go for. Is New England IPAs.
So something else I wanted to bring up. We were talking about performance. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack
No.
the beverage conversation there.
What do you think we're really here for? Come on now.
All right. But another thing, performance-wise, a mistake that I made was trying to put too much load on the database. I found that the browser is much better at handling heavy lifting and data aggregation than Oracle is.
Yes.
So, I mean, I keep alluding to the report creator, but that's been my baby for a long time. I've put many an hour into that thing. And when I first created it, I was...
Look, Eric.
Yeah,
All right.
I know.
Let's get back.
Carla says not to compliment me or I won't get out the office. So...
Those great big bald head of yours.
Hey, your hair's
I remember
gross.
when
Last time we
my
met.
first iteration of the report creator, I was super proud because I basically made one network call and ran this really complex long query that was aggregating all the students' attendance and stored grades and standards grades and anything else we might need into a report into one big payload that came back. And I grabbed that. I had Oracle even format it all as a JSON object.
And I
so
bet it
that
worked.
I love that.
Rain in a
I
dare.
loved when I figured that one out. I'm proud to say, by the way, that I introduced that one to Schmadam Schmarson. He didn't know about that. I taught Schmadam Schmarson something.
Where would he be without you?
Yep.
Where would he be? But so I got all this data back, and I was really proud at how much work went into creating that query so that it was just all ready for me when it got back to the browser. And then after more experience and more testing, I realized, I'm not going to need all this information every time. It made way more sense to split it out and say, get me attendance, get me standards grades, get me stored grades, and then get me the student information and build that information, aggregate it client side. It's so much faster. Plus, that then gave me the liberty to say, you know what? Nobody asked for standard grades on this particular report. Why am I going to tax the database getting that?
Right.
It was bad code.
Funny because every time we start talking and we start talking about different thing, as I'm hearing it and I'm hearing us all talk, it always comes back down to balance. It really does, because here you are, exactly everything you just said. It came back down to balance. Going, you can do that, you can get all that, but you need to find the balance of what you need versus what you can get. And I've walked those same paths completely. When I you know what, I guess I should clarify here just in case I'm misrepresenting Schmarson and myself here. I'm talking about the JSON Oracle methods functions in Oracle. Is that what you were talking about?
Well,
oh no, okay, so you're talking about
I can
Felix.
understand why you would have thought that, but I actually, via string concatenation, built
Oh,
a JSON
that's a whole
string.
other thing. Okay.
But
So
I
I'm
didn't even
talking
know
about-
that the JSON functions, and actually I think in that version of Oracle when I first built it, it wasn't even an option.
They went around till a couple of years ago. and maybe 3 years ago, let's say, I'm guessing. But I figured those ones out, and I remember it was about a year and a half. It was the last Acme when we were in Myrtle Beach. I had shown Adam that, and he was like, "Holy," because it just made his life, something he was working on. It changed his life. But that's what I was talking about. But I mean, as far as actually returning, using T-list to create big JSON packages and bringing them in the controller, which I agree wholeheartedly with. It's making a complex query is way harder on a performance than actually doing it all client side, depending, but doing it all client side.
On that note, I just have a quick question. Like, when you guys talking about Oracle side versus browser side or client side, has that always kind of been true? Since, I mean, kind of referencing back to the last episode as far as our history in PowerSchool, has this kind of been a new thing? Has this been like 5 years, or has it always been more efficient to have the browser do the work rather than the database?
I've always found, and I don't know, I can't give you an actual formula, but I've found there is am I saying that inverse means up, right? Inverse correlation between, so when you're working on actual like Oracle developer directly to the database, the time it takes is exponentially inverse, like on when you're actually in the application to the time it takes on Oracle. So if something takes a fraction of a second when you're running it on Oracle, it'll still come pretty quickly when you're actually in PowerSchool. Gotcha. But when you get up to 5 seconds, now it's going to take 20 to 30 seconds. When you get up to 10 seconds, now come back in a minute.
So it's exponential, I think, is the word that you're thinking of.
Yeah, well, and that's what I found. That's what I've always found. So every additional second just amplifies the wait time to what you're going to be bringing back. So, I mean, I can write a good query, but it doesn't make any difference if that now the user is going to be sitting there forever waiting for that to return. And that's in many ways, because I figured out SQL, and I figured out bringing back my data. And again, here we are with code and where we came from and what we did. I figured out how to get data to my database very early on when I was learning how to do the development and things like that. Where I got hung up for a good period of time was now how to actually make that available to the user. I could pull it out of the database and throw it in a spreadsheet, sure, but that doesn't help anybody. It just makes my job worse, because now I have to do that for every school and every principal and every secretary. I needed to have some way for an interface, and that's when I got into like, aggregate it in the browser, JavaScript. That is the baby. That is the one that's going to do it. So yeah, Eric, like, I mean, yeah, you have it. I agree. And there's my experience from that side of it.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're just querying raw data, that's fine. You need a list tag. You need a pivot. I have never used a pivot in PowerSchool customization when I'm presenting it in the user interface. I will pivot that via the JavaScripts. I realize also it depends on.
I sorry, because you interrupted me earlier, so whatever.
It's only fair.
No, almost. Because I want to say that I agree with that. You've never so I've used pivots in the user interface, but that was before I knew how to use JavaScript effectively. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. When I figured out how to pivot, I was like, oh, this is it. This is great. Now I can present my data out like this. But that was when I looked at T-lists as only to produce rows in a table.
Yeah.
And that wasn't any help in the long run. Now, when I figured out that I can, when I figured out JavaScript, when I learned how to do that, and I can make I can interact with my DOM however I want it. Then it was like, doesn't matter. I don't need to do a pivot. I can just bring my data back, and I'll just use JavaScript to do exactly what I needed to do.
And that's just it. When you say there's, I said early on, I kind of have a feeling there's not a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, or bad code is more of a subjective type thing than objective.
Kind of a knows how I almost
right? If you don't know the JavaScripts, man, and you can put a pivot in your T list and that's how you're going to get it out, are you going to do that? Or are you going to spend the next week getting a firmer grasp on JavaScript when your boss wants it yesterday?
Right.
There you go.
Absolutely. So now that we've kind of defined, so very loosely defined what bad code is, please have a better idea. I want to hear what bad code you guys have written.
It's so hard.
Flip a coin.
There's an overall.
There's got to be one project out there that you were just like,
no, there is, and I can paraphrase to a degree here because I'm sure I've heard this and I'm sure I've said this to some. Bad code you've written is code you've always written a year before now,
right?
Like because
code you learned from, right?
Exactly. Like I'm always better than I was a year ago,
right?
And especially 2 and 3 years ago. And when you look at some of my old stuff, I don't even know, I can't name specific things. No, but I mean, I look at some of the old stuff I've written, and almost down to the fact that how cryptically I named my own variables. You make sense at the time. And sometimes I go with like whimsical names. Sometimes I go logical names, but then you come back to it a year later and you're like, what the hell is loosey goosey? Like you literally loosey goosey, probably because at the time you're like, this is a loosey goosey idea. Let's see if it works. And then it worked. And then you
didn't want to change it. Yeah.
So then you got a call to a loosey goosey function at the bottom.
You'd have to go back and change it in 35 different places.
And then it'll have like 2 arguments, fung and key, because it's funky. So nice. Now I stick with things a little bit more. But I mean, that echoes back to what we're talking about too. With can another developer look at your code and understand? So things I've written in the past few years, I know people could look at and understand. But where I left my old district, the poor people that filled my shoes there. Like, I mean, I was just learning there. And that was like, I had a playground that I could figure things out. And like, I always, like, I delivered a lot of extra functionality there, but I was also making functions and variables like loosey-goosey and fung and key. And I know for sure, like, variables like monkey and giraffe existed. In a lot of that stuff. So, the poor guy who replaced me at some point, he's like, what the hell is monkey? Why does monkey equal X?
Dude, if you want to inject humor into your code, the comments are the place to do it, not the variable names. I've seen some interesting comments out there, and that's always entertaining.
Would you say, you're talking about comments, that's, obviously not part of the functional side of the code, but, would you ever consider not commenting in your code, quote unquote, bad code?
Yes.
Oh yeah,
just absolutely. Blanket statement. Please comment your code.
And it's funny because, again, this comes down to the time crunch and being efficient and being quick. And it all wraps around everything we wrap around, and it wraps up into technical debt. But commenting, it's important, but it can be time consuming. And similar to, like, completely unrelated, but similar to how, as an analogy, a query running on Oracle converts to X amount of time through the application. When you don't put your comments in when you're writing it, going back in and commenting your code afterwards, infinitely longer to do, because now you got to remember what you were thinking.
Yeah.
But it's extra time. It's extra seconds and minutes in the process. And when someone needs something fixed in an hour, someone needs something delivered in an hour, writing in comments ain't going to be on your forethought. You want that, like they need transcripts. They need transcripts because they're going out this afternoon and it ain't working and the printing ain't working and you need it and all the kids are done for the year. You're going in and you're just trying to fix that. You're not worrying about adding comments. That's it.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are guilty of not commenting as thoroughly as we ought to. I do have a couple examples for you, Sean, of the worst code I ever wrote. And what it comes down to is ignorance at the time.
Yeah.
We've talked about that a lot. And it was an interesting story before I was even professionally developing. I remember I was in school and one of my instructors, it was a Java class, not JavaScript, mind you, but Java. And the instructor was telling us, what's that?
They're the same thing, aren't they?
Basically, yeah.
Madam Schmarson knows a thing about that.
Oh, does
he? Yeah. He was telling a story about his professional career when one of his staff came up to him and was so proud. He'd spent hours putting together this function in Java to sort the contents of an array. So you could pass an array to this function and it would send it back out sorted. And he spent hours making sure that it was optimized. And I'm sure it wasn't bad code in that sense, but it was horrible code in the sense that embedded in Java is an array.sort function that somebody smarter than that dude already wrote.
Yep.
For the library at large. So
that's
along those,
right there.
Along
Which,
those
by the way, you use it because I like the word ignorance and ignorant. A lot of people think it means stupid. A lot of people use it.
A lot of times it has a very negative connotation.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us mean that way.
It literally means not knowing. Do not know. I don't, not knowing yet. It's actually, to me, almost a positive thing. It's admitting that you don't know something and it allows you to learn something. So ignorance is not stupidity. It's just lack of knowledge.
Yeah, almost
absolutely
naive.
Right. So the first project I ever did when I got into PowerSchool was processing immunization compliance for state of Wisconsin students.
That's exciting.
And I was pretty proud of what I put together because I created a Java application because I knew Java, not JavaScript, mind you. I created an application that sat outside of PowerSchool that connected to the PowerSchool database to collect student information, like, their student number, et cetera, name, date of birth. And then you'd enter into this application their immunization dates, and it would process their compliance with Wisconsin immunization law. And it had its own database that pulled information out of the PowerSchool database and communicated with this database to make sure that we had all the appropriate information, student information, to generate the reports for the state of Wisconsin immunization compliance. At the time, I didn't know there was such a thing as these things called virtual tables in PowerSchool. Now, this was pre-database extensions.
Right.
That's pre-me.
But still, talk about bringing a gun to a knife fight, man. I created an application and a database when the architecture existed within PowerSchool at the time for me to do that same thing. So that kind of stuff, it's that was killer. Just I was proud of the product that I had, and I made it work, but it was, if I'd known the tools that were at my disposal, if I'd known that Java had a function called array.sort, good Lord,
right.
Not the right approach.
You reminded me of a perfect example right there based on that. Maybe it was a parent-teacher conference application or something that needed a date picker. And again, PowerSchool, they have for Angular or jQuery, they have date picker tag like attributes you can add.
That's better.
I think the non-Angular, like the native stuff, will work based on the data types in your fields. But in your Angular, there's another one. But this is early on in the adoption of Angular and early on in my exploration of Angular. And I didn't understand. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't make it work. And although it was there, it existed, a tag, like an attribute to throw on an element and an input element to get your date picker. I wrote my own. I wrote my own directive that like queried the calendar table with the school, and brought back all the dates and created like a little calendar with that like I built this. I probably spent a couple days on it.
And you were proud of it when you were done, weren't you?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I was proud of it, and I got it stuck in a repo somewhere here. Yeah, like who wouldn't be? Like I made my own date picker. I didn't need to.
And Ryan's like, I'm gonna sell that to PowerSchool. They should have something like this.
PowerSchool did.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's obviously we're talking about a lot of downsides of looking at coding, and I think the resounding solution to to making sure you're not writing bad code is to use the resources that you have at hand, right? So obviously you eventually found out that what you wrote was bad code. How did you end up solving it? Was it things? It was things that you had learned between then and now, right?
I apologize. I have someone knocking at my door that I'm going to have to quickly.
Good, man.
So whilst he's seeing who's knocking at the door, so coming around from that is, I mean, the best developers are curious, right?
Sure.
And I feel like there's a real asterisk.
I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
We'll get over it, but not quickly. So the real asterisk to this that Ryan and I have as a benefit is our job is to develop,
Sure.
right? It is our profession. So when you work,
300 right now. What is your profession?
So it's something that we can invest time in, and we have sometimes time during your work day to invest in that professional development. Sometimes the company will invest in that professional development. But just learning those tools, bouncing ideas off other developers, that's an asterisk to these conversations that I realize probably a lot of our listeners won't have, where their job is database and PowerSchool administrator within their school district, which means 10% of their time is the principal says, I need this custom page.
Yeah.
I don't have time to make myself a JavaScript professional, but that is the key, I think, to writing good code is I may have say again.
Collaboration.
But another key concept, you can get by with just enough to be dangerous. And I might have alluded to this in our first episode, but I really enjoyed the title of this this lecture that I watched on YouTube recently from a guy by the name of Anthony Alisei. For anyone who's listening, if you want to learn more about JavaScript, check this guy out, Anthony Alisei. He's an amazing instructor. The title of one of his series was Understand, Don't Imitate. And I think that's where we all start, right? Like, oh,
sure.
yeah, I can grab this and tweak this, or I got this out of a book. I can kind of copy it in, but I don't really understand why it's doing what it's doing at the core.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, and that's something that challenges me every day. I come to any problem that I have to solve in my development, and I go, gee, I'll bet there's a better way to do this. I could have this done in 5 minutes. Is it worth the research if I look into possibly going this other route? I might figure out a better way in 10 minutes. Or an hour and a half later, I might still be
in the same boat.
No farther along in my productivity. That hour and a half sometimes though is well spent. If I learn something during that time that that increased my knowledge of what's really going on under the hood, understanding instead of imitating, then it was time well spent.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times, I look back in the times that, because I was one of those people that would just take what somebody else has done, pull it in, try to change some things and see if it would work. Right. But along those moments and really diving into it and trying to figure out, why it's working or figuring out a better way to do things, we've all been caught down the rabbit holes of whatever it is, whether it's YouTube or whatever it is. And, sometimes those rabbit holes, whether you may not learn what you needed to learn to do what you were trying to do, but you may learn something else. And you kind of hit the nail on the head that I wanted to make sure everybody knew, like, you guys are professional developers. So that time invested, yeah, well, one of you are. Ryan's still trying to get there. That time that you invest is obviously an investment. But just because that doesn't just work because you're a professional developer. Even your quote unquote armchair developers, the people that are, the admins of PowerSchool sitting in their districts, don't be afraid to take that time to go down those rabbit holes, learn some things.
Yeah.
Learn how things work, because it will make your code better. Even if it's not the answer that you were looking for that day.
That's how I am where I am now. Exactly that. I didn't understand. I really didn't understand. Like, I understood what an object was, I guess, by definition. I didn't understand what an object was.
Sure.
And I would sit there in the DOM inspector for hours expanding, trees and branches and just trying to figure, I would be writing code, rerunning it, then checking out the DOM inspector to see, did it make this thing work now? Is this, right? How do I grab this? Oh, man. And I mean, I learned. And yeah. I those are rabbit holes. There's no doubt. I spent hours in the evenings. Like, I would work in my district all day and then come home and I'd do it all night.
Yeah.
Because I was interested and I was fascinated and want to grow on it, of course. But I mean, yeah, it's like you have to dive in. But I mean, it's ultimately it's the collaboration, like kind of what we started there too with. It's like even as good as you, or as much as you figured out, being able to bounce ideas off someone else, having someone to speak to, even to hear your own ideas bounce off of them, is more important than anything. It gives you that, motivation and that insight that you might not otherwise have. There's a term, rubber ducking. I don't know if you're familiar. Yeah.
No,
so,
I think you're making words up now.
It's on Urban Dictionary. Check it out.
Yeah. So it's when you recite your code, you recite it line by line. When you're really trying to figure out what the hell's going wrong, you're just
really. I've never heard of this. This is a thing.
I'm explaining it to the audience though, or have you? I can't tell now.
No, I seriously have never heard of this.
Okay. So it's when you are actually reading out loud, line by line, your code. And you actually do it all the time. I know you do it because I've talked to you on the phone while you've done it. You just never labeled it as such, but you verbalize what's happening in the code from top to bottom and what's being called and what action is occurring and what argument is being passed in. So it similar to when you're talking with somebody, it helps to actually balance it out, even if it's not to somebody else.
It's like audibly debugging.
Yeah, but even more so when you are talking with somebody.
Yeah.
Just because, I mean, I'm not. We were talking about, the humble pie here. I don't try to mask or hide what I know or what I don't know, because that's counterproductive to my own productivity. And my own ability to learn. So I just need to lay it out. Like when I'm talking to somebody, I'm trying to solve something, I lay it out. And then sometimes, honestly, more often than not, I'll solve my own problem I'll just use Eric, just by talking to Eric and then explaining to him what my issue is and what's happening and what I'm expecting to happen. And then I go, oh,
yeah, never mind.
There we go.
I got it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for just being there.
Humility. I just,
it's huge.
I'm so with you on that. I'm the guy that's not afraid when you're rattling off some nonsense at me to go, and you totally look at me like I should understand everything you're saying. I will say, what does that acronym mean?
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, and at the end of the day, people are embarrassed to do that. But I don't know what other people's experiences are like or reactions are like. But if I say something and you say, I don't know what that means, can you please explain that? If I spouted it out to you like it's an obvious thing, everybody knows that ET stands for extraterrestrial. Well, maybe not everybody does. We can't take that for granted. And I'm going to respect you more if you call me out on assuming some pre-existing knowledge.
Yeah, take advantage of the learning opportunities.
And I feel like when you ask that question, the person, like, it's almost like a read into that person. The person who gets defensive or upset about you asking them to explain that, they're the person that's not as far as ahead as they want you to believe,
Right.
or as strong as they want you to believe, purely because
Yes,
they're
sir.
defensive. Because if they can honestly say, you know what, I don't fully understand it, but here's my best understanding of it, and then maybe let's go and try to figure it out together. That's one thing. That's, it's straightforward. It's honest.
And then
but when
they
they're like,
get it better at the end.
yeah, like, it's just this thing, you don't understand it. I can't explain it to you. You're not going to understand it. Well, you're an idiot. It's not, let's.
Well, you know who's not an idiot is our listeners. Listeners, forget about these guys. Go out there, learn some code. Don't be afraid to write bad code.
Dive in.
And I think out of all of this, one thing that we want to make sure our listeners understand is don't be afraid to write bad code. You're going to learn way more from bad code than copying good code, and it just works.
Well, and you know
Try
what?
yourself.
The biggest thing is
Learn.
learning how to like dive into your code, because anyone who's starting out can open their text editor, or with relation to PowerSchool, go into CPM, but you can write something that keeps failing and then keep trying to modify it, and then it keeps failing but not knowing why. Or you can understand at the very simplest what your developer tools are in your web browser, whether you're using Firefox or Chrome. And there's all, there's a DOM inspector, there's a console log there. I recommend you jump into the DOM inspector. You just right click and go into inspect, and there'll be a tab. Varying depending on which browser you are and how it's called, but go look at your DOM, your document object model. That will be probably the most telling. Even if it's completely Greek to you, even if it looks like complete nonsense to you, which it should if you've never looked at it before.
Right.
But keep looking at it until it starts making some sense. Look for a variable that you named. Look for a variable that you're looking for. Look for like any word that's familiar to you, and start expanding it. And you'll start to unravel it. And I mean, as from how I figured things out, from how I got to point A to point B now, that's largely how I did it.
I just want to say that it's all very pertinent. But I think most importantly, you never want to reference Canadian code.
It's pretty bad. That's the only reason we brought Ryan on, is like teach him the good way of things. All right, guys.
Use too many A's.
EHA, pick one. Anyway, I think that's about the end of this episode, unless you guys have any final thoughts. If not,
Love you guys.
Cheers, boys.
Thanks to everyone for listening.
Next time on an all new Sumbit, we get lazy.
Yeah. Take care, everyone. We will see you next episode.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Enjoy more episodes and learn more at mba-link.com.